The water was ankle deep when I woke up. That's the thing about old buildings in this part of the city. Everything breaks at once, and it breaks spectacularly. The pipe in the wall had been slowly rotting for months, maybe years, until it finally gave up somewhere around 3 in the morning. By the time I stumbled out of bed, my hardwood floors were warped beyond recognition, my books were floating like dead fish, and my laptop was making sounds I'd never heard before. The landlord showed up around noon with a contractor who took one look at the damage and shook his head like he was viewing a crime scene. 6 weeks, he said. Maybe 8. Depends on what we find behind the walls. What about my security deposit? I asked, because I had to ask, even though I already knew the answer. The landlord shrugged. Water damage isn't covered. You'll have to talk to your insurance. I didn't have insurance. Not the kind that covered this anyway. I had the bare minimum, the kind that kept me legal but wouldn't keep me housed. So there I was, 28 years old, standing in my ruined apartment with everything I owned either underwater or packed into 2 duffel bags, trying to figure out where the hell I was supposed to go. My parents lived 3 states away and still asked when I was going to find a nice girl. My few close friends were either married with no space or barely scraping by in studio apartments smaller than my current disaster. I sat on my fire escape for an hour, scrolling through my contacts, getting more desperate with each swipe. That's when I landed on a name I hadn't seen in 8 months, David Chen. Not David. I deleted David's number the day after we broke up in a fit of necessary self-preservation. This was Marcus Chen, David's older brother, the one who'd been polite but distant during the year and a half David and I were together, the one who owned a house in Greenpoint and worked some mysterious job that let him afford it, the one who'd always made me feel like he was listening to conversations I wasn't having. I stared at his name for 10 minutes before I typed anything. Hey, it's Jake. David's, my apartment flooded. Pipe burst. I know this is weird, but do you know anyone looking for a temporary roommate? Couple weeks, maybe less. I sent it before I could delete it, then immediately wanted to throw my phone off the fire escape. The reply came back in less than 5 minutes. Yeah, come over. No questions. No sorry to hear that or how bad is it or even what happened with you and David. Just an address I already knew and 4 words that somehow felt like more than I deserved. I packed what was salvageable, left my key with the super, and took the L train to Greenpoint with my entire life condensed into 2 bags and a backpack. Marcus's house looked exactly the same as it had 8 months ago. Narrow brick facade, black iron gate, the kind of place that looked unassuming from the street but probably cost more than I'd make in 5 years. I stood outside for 10 minutes trying to convince myself this wasn't the worst idea I'd ever had. When I finally rang the bell, he answered so quickly I wondered if he'd been waiting by the door. Hey, he said. Hey. Same as always. Marcus looked like a refined version of David, if David had ever bothered to iron his shirts or get a haircut that cost more than $20. Dark hair cut close on the sides, longer on top, the kind of bone structure that made you wonder if he'd ever had an awkward phase. Wearing a white button-down rolled to his elbows and dark jeans that fit like they'd been tailored. He looked at my bags but didn't comment, just stepped aside to let me in. The house still smelled like coffee and something else, cedar maybe, or sandalwood, clean in a way that felt intentional but not sterile. I'd forgotten how quiet it was here, how the thick walls seemed to muffle even the sound of traffic from outside. Bathroom's down the hall, he said, closing the door behind me. Sheets are clean. You hungry? I shifted the duffel bag on my shoulder, hyper-aware of how out of place I felt in his perfectly organized entryway. I'm good, just thanks. He nodded once efficiently, like we'd just concluded a business transaction. No eye contact. Not yet. Upstairs, he said, already moving toward the staircase. Second door on the right. I followed him up the narrow stairs, watching the back of his neck, the way his shoulders moved under his shirt. It was the same staircase I'd climbed dozens of times when David and I were together, but it felt different now, charged with something I couldn't name. The spare bedroom was small but perfect. Queen bed with white linens, a dresser, a window that looked out onto a small garden I'd never noticed before. Neutral and clean and completely impersonal, like a hotel room designed by someone with excellent taste. There's towels in the closet, Marcus said, setting my larger bag down by the dresser. Kitchen's downstairs if you need anything. I'll probably just order something, I said, because the thought of making myself at home in his kitchen felt like crossing a line I wasn't ready to cross. I was going to make dinner anyway, he said. 7:30. It wasn't a question exactly, but it wasn't not an invitation either. I nodded because I didn't know what else to do. Okay, thanks. He paused in the doorway, and for a second I thought he might say something else. Something about why he'd said yes or what this meant or whether he'd talked to David recently. Instead, he just nodded again and left, closing the door behind him with a soft click. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked around the room that was going to be mine for the next few weeks. Everything was exactly where it should be, nothing out of place, no personality visible anywhere. It was the kind of space that made you want to whisper. I unpacked slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. Hung my few decent shirts in the closet, put my toiletries in the bathroom down the hall, arranged my books on the dresser in a way that looked intentional rather than desperate. The whole time I could hear Marcus moving around downstairs, the quiet sounds of someone who lived alone and was used to it. By 7:30, I'd showered, changed into clean clothes, and given myself enough pep talks to face whatever this dinner was going to be. I found him in the kitchen, which looked like something out of a magazine. White subway tile, dark countertops, copper pots hanging from a rack that probably cost more than my rent. He'd made pasta with something that smelled incredible, opened a bottle of red wine, set two places at the small table by the window. Everything looked effortless in the way that meant he'd probably put thought into every detail. This looks amazing, I said, because it did and because the silence was already too loud. It's just carbonara, he said, serving me a portion that was perfectly reasonable but somehow felt generous. Wine? I nodded and he poured me a glass of something that tasted expensive. We sat across from each other at the table and I was struck by how familiar this felt. How many times had I sat at this same table when David and I were together? But it had never been just Marcus and me. There had always been David there to fill the spaces, to chatter about his day or complain about his students, or ask Marcus about work in that way siblings do, casual and expectant. Now it was just us, and the silence felt like its own presence at the table. The pasta was perfect, creamy and rich and exactly the kind of comfort food I needed after the day I'd had. Marcus ate with the same efficient precision he seemed to apply to everything else, and I found myself watching his hands, the way he twirled his fork, the way he reached for his wine glass. The sound of cutlery against plates seemed impossibly loud. I tried to think of something to say, but everything that came to mind felt either too personal or too trivial. So I ate and tried not to stare and wondered what the hell I was doing here. Finally, Marcus set down his fork and looked at me directly for the first time since I'd arrived. So, how long's the place unlivable? Couple weeks, maybe, I said. Depends on what they find when they start tearing things apart. All right. That was it. No reaction, no follow-up questions, no sympathy or reassurance. He just nodded once and went back to eating, like we'd settled a practical matter and could now return to our respective silences. I finished my wine and tried to figure out if I was relieved or disappointed by his lack of curiosity. Part of me had been dreading the questions I thought he might ask. About David, about why I'd texted him instead of anyone else, about what I was planning to do if the repairs took longer than expected. But another part of me had been hoping he'd ask, just so I'd have an excuse to explain myself. This is really good, I said, gesturing at my mostly empty plate. Thanks. We finished the meal in the same loaded quiet, and when I offered to help with dishes, he just shook his head and started clearing the table with the same methodical efficiency he'd brought to everything else. I stood there for a moment, unsure whether I was dismissed or expected to linger, then mumbled something about being tired and headed upstairs. But I wasn't tired, not really. I was wired from the day, from the strangeness of being here, from the weight of all the things Marcus hadn't said. I lay in the unfamiliar bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of him moving around downstairs, washing dishes, turning off lights, the quiet creak of floorboards that meant he was walking around in a house that was entirely his. I must have dozed off eventually because when I woke up it was past midnight and the house was completely silent. I'd been dreaming about something I couldn't quite remember, but it left me restless and too warm under the covers. I got up and padded downstairs in my t-shirt and boxer shorts, thinking I'd get some water and maybe find a book to read until I could fall back asleep. The kitchen was dark, but there was light coming from the living room. Marcus was there, sitting in the chair by the window with a book in his lap and a reading lamp casting a warm circle around him. He'd changed into a gray t-shirt and flannel pajama pants, and his hair was mussed in a way that made him look younger, less carefully assembled. He looked up when I appeared in the doorway but didn't seem surprised to see me. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. "Yeah, no, I stopped, took a breath. "I was going to get some water." He nodded toward the kitchen. "Help yourself." I filled a glass from the tap and came back to the living room, hovering in the doorway like I was waiting for permission to exist in his space. The smart thing would have been to take my water and go back upstairs, but something about the quiet of the house, the soft light, the way he'd gone back to reading like my presence was perfectly normal, made me want to stay. "What are you reading?" I asked. He held up the cover, something literary I'd heard of but never read, the kind of book that won awards and made you feel smarter for owning it. "Any good?" "It's fine," he said, which I was learning was Marcus's version of effusive praise. I sat down on the couch across from him, tucked my feet under me, and sipped my water. He went back to reading. I just sat there watching him read, trying to figure out why this felt so natural when everything else about being here felt like I was pretending to be someone I wasn't. The thing was, this wasn't entirely unfamiliar. During those 18 months with David, there had been plenty of evenings like this. David would fall asleep early or go to bed with a headache, and I'd find myself downstairs with Marcus. We'd never talked much during those times either, but there had been something comfortable about sharing space with him, something that felt like companionship without requiring conversation. I'd always told myself I was just being polite, just killing time until David woke up or I felt ready to go home. But sitting here now, I could admit that maybe it had been more than that. Maybe I'd been drawn to something about Marcus that I hadn't been ready to name, the way he seemed so entirely himself, so uninterested in performing for anyone else. The way he'd look at me sometimes, like he was seeing something I didn't know I was showing. There had been one night in particular, maybe 4 months into my relationship with David, when David had gotten food poisoning and spent the evening alternating between sleeping and being sick. I'd stayed to take care of him, and around 11 Marcus had found me in the kitchen making tea. "He's sleeping," I'd said unnecessarily. "Good," Marcus had replied, then started making his own tea without asking if I wanted company. We'd ended up sitting at the kitchen table, not talking, just drinking our tea and existing in the same space. At some point, Marcus had looked up from his mug and caught me staring at him, and instead of looking away immediately, I'd held his gaze for a beat too long. "You okay?" he'd asked, and something about the way he said it made me think he wasn't just asking about David's food poisoning. "Yeah," I'd said, but it had come out softer than I'd intended, less certain. He'd nodded slowly, like he understood something I hadn't said, and went back to his tea. But the air in the kitchen had felt different after that, charged with something that made me hyper-aware of how close we were sitting, how quiet the house was, how easy it would be to say something that couldn't be taken back. I'd gone home soon after that, and we'd never had another late-night tea session. But I'd thought about it more than I should have, wondered what might have happened if I'd been braver or if he'd said something first. Now, sitting in his living room at midnight with no David sleeping upstairs, I felt that same charge in the air, the same sense of something hovering just beneath the surface of our careful politeness. Marcus turned a page, and the soft rustle of paper seemed to fill the entire room. I shifted on the couch, and the leather made a small creaking sound that felt too loud. He glanced up at me, and our eyes met for just a second before I looked away, focusing on my water glass like it contained the secrets of the universe. "You don't have to stay up," he said quietly. if you want to try sleeping again." "I'm okay," I said. "Unless you want me to go. I don't want to disturb your reading." "You're not disturbing anything." The way he said it was matter of fact, but something about his tone made me look at him again. He was watching me with that same expression I remembered from the kitchen that night, like he was trying to figure out what I wasn't saying. "Okay," I said, settling back into the couch cushions. He went back to his book, and I went back to watching him read, and somehow the silence between us felt less loaded than it had at dinner. Maybe it was the late hour or the soft light or the way we were both dressed down and informal, but the careful distance he'd been maintaining since I arrived seemed to have relaxed just slightly. I found myself studying his face in the lamplight, the strong line of his jaw, the way his eyebrows drew together slightly when he was concentrating, the way his lips moved almost imperceptibly as he read. He was handsome in a way that was completely different from David, more angular, more reserved, more substantial somehow, like he took up exactly the amount of space he needed and not 1 inch more. David had always been restless, always moving, always talking or humming or drumming his fingers on whatever surface was nearby. Being with David was like being around a benevolent storm, exciting and unpredictable and occasionally exhausting. Marcus was the opposite of that. He had the kind of stillness that made you want to move carefully around him, not because he was fragile, but because he seemed so entirely contained, so purposeful in every gesture. I must have been staring too intently because he looked up again and caught me watching him. "What?" he asked, and there was something almost amused in his voice. "Nothing," I said quickly. "Just, this is nice. Quiet." "You like quiet?" It seemed like a genuine question, not just polite conversation, so I thought about it seriously before answering. "I like this kind of quiet," I said. "The kind where you're not alone." He nodded slowly, like that made perfect sense to him, and something in his expression softened just slightly. "Yeah," he said. "I know what you mean." We looked at each other for a moment that lasted a beat too long, and I felt that same electric possibility I'd felt in his kitchen all those months ago, the sense that we were having a conversation that was happening entirely beneath the surface of the words we were actually saying. Then Marcus went back to his book, and I went back to my water, and the moment passed. But something had shifted between us. Some invisible barrier had moved just slightly, and I found myself breathing a little easier. Hours passed like that. Marcus read, I sat and thought and occasionally dozed, and neither of us felt the need to fill the silence with unnecessary words. It was the most comfortable I'd felt all day, maybe the most comfortable I'd felt in months. At some point, I started getting genuinely sleepy, and I must have been nodding off because the next thing I knew, Marcus was setting his book aside and reaching for something on the side table next to his chair. It was a throw blanket, soft and gray and exactly the right size to cover someone curled up on a couch. He stood up and walked over to me, and I was suddenly very aware that I was wearing nothing but a t-shirt and boxers, that my hair was probably sticking up in all directions, that I probably looked like exactly what I was, a man with nowhere else to go, making himself at home in someone else's living room. But Marcus didn't seem to see any of that. He just shook out the blanket and draped it over me with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything else. His fingers brushed against mine as he arranged the blanket over my shoulders, and neither of us pulled away immediately. The contact lasted maybe 3 seconds longer than it needed to, his warm fingers against my knuckles, and in those 3 seconds I felt something pass between us that was definitely not casual, definitely not brotherly, definitely not the kind of thing you were supposed to feel about your ex-boyfriend's older brother. "Better?" he asked, and his voice was softer than it had been all evening. "Yeah," I said, and my voice came out rougher than I'd intended. "Thanks." He stepped back, but he didn't go back to his chair immediately. Instead, he stood there looking down at me for a moment, and I had the strange feeling that he was trying to decide whether to say something. "Marcus," I started, though I had no idea what I was going to say next. "Get some sleep," he said, cutting me off gently. "You've had a long day." I nodded and settled deeper into the couch, pulling the blanket up to my chin. It smelled like him, clean and warm and something that might have been his cologne, or might have just been the way his house smelled. He turned off the reading lamp and the room went dark except for the faint light coming from the kitchen. I heard him moving around, the soft sounds of someone getting ready to go upstairs, and I closed my eyes and tried to ignore the way my heart was beating just slightly too fast. I was almost asleep when I heard his footsteps heading toward the stairs. Then they stopped. "Jake," he said quietly, and I opened my eyes to see his silhouette in the doorway. "Yeah." There was a long pause, long enough that I wondered if he'd changed his mind about whatever he was going to say. "You can stay as long as you need," he said finally. I sat up slightly, trying to see his face in the darkness. "You sure?" Another pause. Then, "I was before." And with that, he was gone, his footsteps quiet on the stairs, leaving me alone in his living room with a blanket that smelled like him and the echo of something in his voice that sounded almost like a promise. I lay there for a long time after that, staring at the ceiling and trying to figure out what had just happened. The smart thing would be to find another place to stay as soon as possible before whatever this was between us got any more complicated than it already was. The smart thing would be to keep my distance, be polite, but not friendly, treat this like the temporary arrangement it was supposed to be. But as I finally drifted off to sleep on Marcus Chen's couch, wrapped in his blanket and thinking about the way his fingers had felt against mine, I was pretty sure I wasn't going to do the smart thing. I was pretty sure I was going to stay exactly as long as he'd let me. Oh, party. Woke up on his couch to the smell of coffee and the sound of rain against the windows. For a moment, I forgot where I was. Then I saw Marcus moving around the kitchen in my peripheral vision. White t-shirt, dark jeans, hair still damp from the shower, and everything came flooding back. The burst pipe, the ruined apartment, the text message I'd sent without thinking it through, the way his fingers had felt against mine when he'd covered me with the blanket, the way he'd said, "I was before," like it meant something I wasn't ready to understand yet. I sat up slowly, trying to work the crick out of my neck from sleeping on the couch. The blanket pulled around my waist, and I caught Marcus glancing over at me before he turned back to whatever he was doing at the counter. "Morning," I said, my voice rough with sleep. "Coffee's fresh," he replied without turning around. I folded the blanket carefully and left it draped over the back of the couch, then pattered into the kitchen. Marcus had already pulled 2 mugs from the cabinet, the same white ceramic ones I remembered from when David and I used to have breakfast here on weekend mornings. But something about seeing them now in this context made them feel different, more intentional. Marcus poured coffee into 1 mug and handed it to me, our fingers brushing again in the handoff. This time I was ready for it, but that didn't make the contact any less electric. He didn't pull away immediately, and neither did I. We stood there for maybe 2 seconds longer than necessary, his warm fingers against mine, before he let go and reached for the second mug. "Thanks," I said. He nodded and poured his own coffee, then leaned against the counter across from me. The kitchen wasn't large, so we were maybe 4 feet apart, close enough that I could smell his soap and see the way his t-shirt stretched across his chest. "Sleep okay?" he asked. "Yeah, actually. Better than I expected." "Good." We drank our coffee in the same comfortable silence that had settled between us the night before, but there was something different about it now, less tentative, maybe. Like we'd established that we could exist in the same space without it being awkward, without having to perform conversation for each other's benefit. I found myself watching the way Marcus drank his coffee, slow, deliberate sips, like he was actually tasting it instead of just using it for caffeine. Everything he did seemed considered, purposeful. It was so different from the way David approached mornings, which was usually a frantic rush of activity and complaint about having to be awake. "I should probably call my landlord," I said eventually. "See if there's any update on the repairs." "Use the phone in the living room if you want privacy," Marcus said. The offer was practical, considerate, and somehow made my chest feel tight, like he understood that I might need space to fall apart if the news was bad and he was giving me room to do it without an audience. The landlord's update was about what I'd expected. The contractor had found more damage than initially thought. The timeline was looking more like 6 weeks than 2, and no, they still couldn't guarantee anything about my security deposit. I hung up feeling deflated and displaced all over again. When I came back to the kitchen, Marcus was rinsing out his mug in the sink. He didn't ask about the call, but he looked at me with a question in his eyes. 6 weeks, I said. Maybe more. He nodded once like he'd been expecting that. Is that okay? I asked, because I had to ask, even though the thought of finding somewhere else to go made me feel slightly panicked. I already told you it was, he said, and there was something almost gentle in his voice. Not soft exactly, Marcus didn't do soft, but careful in a way that made me think he could see how close I was to the edge of my composure. Right, I said. Sorry, this isn't exactly how I planned to spend my spring. Plans change, he said, which was maybe the most philosophical thing I'd ever heard him say. He dried his hands on a dish towel and hung it back on its hook with the same precise movements he applied to everything else. Then he grabbed his keys from the counter and headed toward the front door. I'll be back around 6, he said. Help yourself to whatever. And then he was gone, leaving me alone in his perfectly organized house with 6 weeks stretching ahead of me and no idea what I was supposed to do with any of it. The days developed a rhythm. Marcus left for work every morning around 8:30. I never asked what he did, and he never volunteered the information, but it involved a lot of phone calls and seemed to pay well enough to afford a house in Greenpoint. I'd hear him moving around upstairs while I made coffee and tried to figure out how to fill the hours until he came home. I spent most of the first week applying for jobs, calling about apartments I couldn't afford, and trying to salvage what I could of my freelance writing career from Marcus's kitchen table. It wasn't ideal. I needed a quieter space to do phone interviews, and I missed having my own desk, my own books, my own mess to work in. But it was functional, better than trying to work from a coffee shop or the library every day. Marcus never commented on my presence in his space during the day, never made me feel like I was intruding or overstaying my welcome. When he came home in the evenings, he'd nod hello and ask how my day was in the same polite, slightly formal way he'd been asking since I arrived. I'd give him some generic answer about job applications or apartment hunting, and he'd nod again and go about his evening routine. We fell into an easy pattern of shared dinners. Sometimes he cooked, sometimes I did, sometimes we ordered takeout and ate it standing in the kitchen while scrolling through our phones. We didn't talk much during these meals, but the silence felt companionable now rather than awkward, like we were both people who understood the value of quiet. But underneath the routine, something was shifting. Little things, almost imperceptible changes that I might have missed if I hadn't been paying such close attention to every detail of our interactions. The way Marcus started leaving coffee ready for me in the mornings, so all I had to do was pour it. The way he'd casually mention when he was going to the grocery store in case I needed anything. The way he never once made me feel like a guest, never treated me like someone who was temporarily taking up space in his life. And the way we kept finding excuses to touch, reaching for the same cabinet handle, passing each other in the narrow hallway, the brief contact when he'd hand me a plate or I'd pass him the salt. Little moments that lasted a fraction of a second longer than they needed to, that left me hyper-aware of the warmth of his skin and the careful way he never pulled away first. It was a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after I'd arrived, when something shifted more substantially. I was standing at the counter making coffee, still in my t-shirt and boxers from sleeping, when Marcus came downstairs already dressed for work. He moved around me to get to the cabinet where he kept the mugs, and we did our usual careful dance of trying not to bump into each other in the small space. But when we both reached for the same mug at the same time, his favorite, white ceramic with a small chip on the handle that he never seemed to notice, our hands collided more definitively than they ever had before. This time, instead of the brief brush of fingers, my entire hand covered his as we both gripped the mug. I could feel the warmth of his palm, the slight roughness of his knuckles, the way his fingers stilled under mine instead of pulling away. We stood like that for what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds, both of us staring down at our joined hands on the mug handle. I could hear my own breathing, could feel my pulse in my throat, could smell his soap and the faint scent of whatever he used in his hair. "Sorry," I said quietly, though I didn't move my hand. "It's fine," he said, and his voice was softer than usual. Finally, slowly, he extracted his hand from under mine and reached for a different mug from the cabinet. But he didn't move away immediately, and when I looked up, I found him watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Coffee?" I asked, holding up the pot. "Yeah," he said, and handed me the second mug. I poured coffee for both of us, hyper-aware of how close he was standing, how easy it would be to close the small distance between us. When I handed him his mug, our fingers touched again, deliberately this time, and I saw something flicker in his eyes that looked almost like recognition, like he was finally seeing something he'd been trying not to notice. We drank our coffee standing there in the kitchen, closer than we needed to be, not talking but not moving away from each other either. And when Marcus finally left for work, he paused in the doorway and looked back at me with an expression that made my chest feel tight. "See you tonight," he said, and something about the way he said it felt different from all the other mornings, like he was actually looking forward to it. That afternoon, I was looking through the kitchen drawers trying to find a can opener when I discovered the photo. It was in the junk drawer, wedged between a roll of tape and a packet of batteries. A candid shot that must have been taken sometime last fall, maybe at David's birthday party. The three of us were in it, David in the middle, grinning at the camera with his arm around my shoulders, me laughing at something off camera, and Marcus standing slightly apart, watching us with that same unreadable expression he always seemed to wear. But it wasn't David or me that made me stare at the photo longer than I should have. It was the way Marcus was looking at us in the picture, not at David, not at the camera, but at me. There was something in his expression that I'd never noticed at the time, something almost wistful, like he was watching something he wanted but knew he couldn't have. I stood there in his kitchen holding this photo that he'd kept in his junk drawer for reasons I couldn't fathom, trying to remember when it had been taken. Had I been aware of him watching me like that? Had David? More importantly, why had Marcus kept it? I put the photo back where I'd found it and tried to forget about it, but it stayed with me for the rest of the day. Every time I walked through the kitchen, I thought about it sitting there in the drawer, thought about the expression on Marcus's face, thought about all the times during my relationship with David when I'd caught Marcus looking at me and told myself I was imagining things. That night, Marcus came home with Thai takeout and an apology about working late. We ate pad Thai and green curry standing at the counter talking about nothing important, but I kept thinking about the photo, about the way he'd been looking at me in it, and the way he was looking at me now, careful, guarded, but with something underneath that felt increasingly familiar. When I went upstairs to bed, I noticed he'd left the hall light on. He never left the hall light on. It was such a small thing, probably meaningless, but it felt like an acknowledgement somehow. Like he knew I'd found the photo, knew what it meant, and was leaving me a small gesture of, what, apology, understanding? I lay in bed that night thinking about wistful expressions and hall lights and the way Marcus's hand had felt under mine that morning, and I realized I was in trouble. The kind of trouble that started with noticing someone's small kindnesses and ended with wanting things you had no right to want. The kind of trouble that made you stare too long at old photographs and read meaning into every casual touch. 2 days later, we finally talked about it. Not the photo, I never mentioned finding it, and Marcus never acknowledged leaving the light on. But the other thing, the thing that had been hovering between us since the night I'd first slept on his couch. I was washing dishes after dinner when Marcus came up beside me with a dish towel, close enough that our shoulders were almost touching. We'd developed this routine over the past week and a half. I'd wash, he'd dry, and we'd work in the kind of comfortable silence that felt more intimate than conversation. But that night, something felt different, charged, like we were both waiting for something to break. "You ever think about that time?" Marcus asked suddenly, his voice so quiet I almost missed it over the sound of running water. I knew immediately what he meant, but I asked anyway. "Which? You know which." I did know. The late-night tea session, the moment in his kitchen when we'd looked at each other too long and I'd felt like we were on the verge of saying something that couldn't be taken back. I turned off the water and set down the plate I'd been washing, not looking at him. "Yeah," I said finally. "I think about it." "Me too." The silence that followed felt enormous, heavy with everything we weren't saying. I could hear Marcus breathing beside me, could feel the warmth radiating from his body in the small space between us. "I thought I was imagining it," I said. "You weren't." I turned to look at him then, and found him watching me with an expression that was more open than anything I'd seen from him since I'd arrived, like he'd finally decided to let me see what he'd been hiding. "What does that mean?" I asked. He was quiet for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he set down the dish towel and leaned against the counter, creating just enough distance between us that I could breathe again. "It means," he said carefully, "that this situation is more complicated than either of us planned." "Because of David." "Because of David," he agreed. "And because of things that don't have anything to do with David." I knew what he meant, but I needed him to say it. Needed to hear the words out loud so I'd know I wasn't making this up in my head. "What things?" He looked at me for a long moment, and I could see him weighing his words, deciding how much he was willing to admit. "Things I should have dealt with a long time ago," he said finally. It wasn't a confession exactly, but it was close enough. Close enough to make my pulse speed up. Close enough to make me want to take a step closer to him instead of maintaining the careful distance we'd been keeping. "Marcus," I started, but he shook his head. "We don't have to figure this out tonight," he said. "Or any night. I wanted you to know that you weren't imagining it." I nodded because what else could I do? We were having a conversation about something we couldn't name, making admissions we couldn't take back, and somehow it felt like the most honest we'd been with each other since I'd arrived. "Okay," I said. "Okay," he repeated, and picked up the dish towel again. We finished the dishes in silence, but it was a different kind of silence now. Less careful, more aware, like we'd acknowledged something that had been there all along and were still figuring out what to do with it. The thunderstorm came 3 nights later. I'd been sleeping better since that conversation in the kitchen, not because anything had been resolved, but because at least now I knew I wasn't losing my mind. The tension between Marcus and me was real, mutual, and complicated as hell, but it wasn't one-sided. That should have been comforting, but mostly it just made everything feel more fraught. Every casual touch, every shared glance, every moment of comfortable silence felt loaded with potential now. Like we were both waiting for someone to make the first move while simultaneously trying to make sure it never happened. The storm woke me up around 2 in the morning. Thunder so loud it seemed to shake the house, rain hitting the windows like someone throwing gravel. I lay in bed listening to it for a while, oddly comforted by the violence of it. There was something satisfying about weather that matched the internal turbulence I'd been carrying around for the past 2 weeks. But after 20 minutes of listening to the storm, I was wide awake and restless. I got up and padded downstairs in my t-shirt and boxers, thinking I'd make some tea or find a book to read until the thunder passed. The living room was dark except for the occasional flash of lightning, but I could see Marcus's silhouette by the window. He was sitting in his usual chair, but instead of reading, he was just watching the storm. Something about the sight of him there, still and contemplative in the darkness, made me pause in the doorway. "Couldn't sleep?" I asked softly. He turned toward me, and in the brief flash of lightning I could see his face. He looked tired, but not in a way that suggested he'd been trying to sleep. "I like storms," he said. "Always have." I crossed the room and sat on the couch, close enough to see him, but far enough away that I wasn't invading his space. Another flash of lightning illuminated both of us, and I caught him looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You don't have to be quiet around me," he said suddenly. "What?" "In general," he clarified. "You move around this house like you're trying not to disturb anything, like you're afraid of taking up space." I considered that. He wasn't wrong. I had been trying to minimize my presence to be as unobtrusive as possible. It had seemed like the polite thing to do, the considerate way to handle being a guest in someone's home. "I don't want to impose," I said. You're not imposing, you're living here. There's a difference. The thunder crashed again, closer this time, and I watched Marcus's face in the brief moment of illumination. He looked serious, thoughtful, like he was trying to work out a problem that didn't have an easy solution. Neither do you, I said. What? You don't have to be quiet around me either. I feel like I feel like you're performing politeness, like you're trying to be the perfect host instead of just being yourself. He was quiet for a long moment, and I wondered if I'd overstepped. But when he spoke, his voice was softer than usual. I'm not sure you'd like me if I wasn't being polite. Try me. Another flash of lightning, another crack of thunder. In the brief moment of light, I saw Marcus looking at me with something that might have been surprise or maybe just curiosity. You want to know what I'm really thinking right now? He asked. Yes. I'm thinking that this is the longest conversation we've ever had, and I'm thinking that I should probably go upstairs and let you get back to sleep, and I'm thinking that I don't want to do that. His honesty caught me off guard, made my chest feel tight in a way that had nothing to do with the storm. So don't, I said. We sat there in the darkness, listening to the rain and the thunder, and for the first time since I'd arrived, the silence between us felt completely natural, not careful or loaded or tentative, just comfortable. Like we were two people who enjoyed each other's company and didn't need to justify it or analyze it or worry about what it meant. Can I ask you something? I said eventually. Yeah. That night when David had food poisoning, when we were in the kitchen, I remember. What were you thinking about when you looked at me like that? Another long pause, long enough that I thought he might not answer. I was thinking that my brother was an idiot, he said finally. Why? Because he had something good and he didn't seem to notice. The words hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. I felt my heart start beating faster, felt that familiar electricity that seemed to spark whenever we got too close to acknowledging what was really happening here. Marcus, I know, he said quietly. I know it's complicated. I know it's fucked up. I know there are about a dozen reasons why this is a bad idea. This? Whatever this is, whatever it's becoming. I wanted to ask him what he thought it was becoming, wanted to close the distance between us, wanted to stop dancing around the obvious attraction that had been building between us since the moment I'd walked through his front door with my duffel bags and my desperation. But I also knew he was right about it being complicated. David might be my ex, but he was Marcus's brother, and I was essentially homeless, dependent on Marcus's kindness for having a roof over my head. The power dynamic was all wrong, the timing was terrible, and there were so many ways this could end badly that I couldn't even begin to count them. Yeah, I said finally, it's complicated. But I looked at him, trying to make out his expression in the darkness between lightning flashes. But I don't think I care as much as I should. He was quiet for a long time after that, and I wondered if I'd said too much, been too honest about what I was feeling, what I was starting to want. Jake, he said finally, and something about the way he said my name made me hold my breath. Yeah? We should probably talk about this when it's not 2 in the morning and there's not a thunderstorm making everything feel more dramatic than it actually is. He was being reasonable, practical, the voice of maturity and good judgment. Everything I should have been but couldn't seem to manage when it came to him. You're probably right, I said. But not tonight? Not tonight. We stayed there until the storm passed, talking occasionally but mostly just existing in the same space, sharing the strange intimacy of being awake together while the rest of the world slept. And when I finally went back upstairs, I carried with me the echo of his voice saying my brother was an idiot and the knowledge that whatever was happening between us had moved past the point of being ignorable. By the end of the 3rd week, we'd settled into something that felt almost like domesticity. Marcus would come home from work and find me at the kitchen table with my laptop, surrounded by the controlled chaos of job applications and freelance projects. He'd ask about my day, I'd ask about his, and we'd figure out dinner together like we'd been doing it for years instead of weeks. The conversations were still careful, still dancing around the obvious tension between us, but they were getting longer, more personal. I learned that Marcus had studied architecture but ended up in real estate development, that he read voraciously but never talked about books unless directly asked, that he'd lived alone for so long he'd forgotten how to make conversation during meals until I'd arrived. He learned that I'd been a journalist before I'd started freelancing, that I missed having colleagues but didn't miss having a boss, that I'd grown up in a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business and had spent most of my adult life trying to find the right balance between solitude and connection. We were getting to know each other in a way that felt both natural and dangerous. Natural because we seemed to fit together so easily, dangerous because every new thing I learned about him made me want to know more, made me want to stay longer, dig deeper, find out what he was like when he wasn't being carefully polite. The physical awareness between us was getting harder to ignore, too. We developed a dozen small rituals that involved brief contact, passing each other plates, reaching around each other for things in the kitchen, the way Marcus would sometimes put his hand on my shoulder when he was moving behind me in the narrow galley, little touches that felt casual but lasted just slightly too long. That left me hyper-aware of the warmth of his skin and the careful way he never made them feel accidental. I started noticing other things too, the way he'd pause sometimes when he found me reading on the couch, like he was taking a mental photograph, the way he'd make extra coffee in the mornings without being asked, the way he'd started leaving small offerings around the house, a book he thought I might like on the kitchen table, a bar of expensive soap in the bathroom, a blanket that appeared on the couch one evening without explanation. It was Marcus taking care of me in the same quiet, understated way he seemed to approach everything else, and it was working. I was sleeping better, eating better, feeling more settled than I had in months. Even my work was going well. Something about the calm of his house, the routine we'd established, seemed to be good for my creativity, but it was also making it harder to maintain the illusion that this was temporary, that I was just staying here until my apartment was fixed, just passing through his life without leaving a mark. The truth was I was starting to feel at home in Marcus's house, more at home than I'd felt in my own apartment, if I was being honest. And that scared me almost as much as the growing certainty that I was falling for someone I had no business falling for. It all came to a head on a Friday night, 3.5 weeks after I'd arrived. Marcus had worked late and come home looking stressed and tired, the kind of exhaustion that seemed to come from more than just a long day. He'd eaten dinner mechanically, answered my questions about his day with uncharacteristic brevity, and spent the evening on his laptop with a kind of intense focus that suggested he was dealing with something complicated. I'd given him space, settled on the couch with a book, and tried not to watch him working at the kitchen table. But I could feel his tension from across the room, could see the way he kept rubbing his temples and staring at his screen like it personally offended him. Around 10:30, he finally closed the laptop and sat back in his chair with a sigh that sounded like defeat. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Just work stuff," he said. But something in his voice suggested it was more than that. "Anything I can help with?" He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something in his expression that made my chest feel tight, like he wanted to say yes but didn't know how to ask. "It's complicated," he said finally. "Most things are." He was quiet for a moment, then got up from the table and came over to the couch. Instead of sitting in his usual chair, he sat on the opposite end of the couch from me, close enough that I could see the exhaustion in his eyes. "There's a project," he said. "Something I've been working on for months, and it's not going well." "What kind of project?" "Development. A building in the village that's been sitting empty for years. I've been trying to put together a plan to convert it into affordable housing, but every time I think I've got the financing figured out, something else falls through, but..." He sounded frustrated in a way I'd never heard from him before, like he cared about this more than he was comfortable admitting. "That sounds like important work," I said. "It is, or it would be if I could actually make it happen." He ran a hand through his hair, messing up the careful styling. "Sometimes I think I should just give up, focus on projects that actually make money instead of trying to save the world one building at a time." "But you don't want to do that." "No, I don't." There was something vulnerable about seeing Marcus like this, not perfectly composed, not carefully controlled, just tired and frustrated and human. It made me want to reach out and touch him, to offer some kind of comfort. "Why is it so important to you?" I asked instead. He was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands folded in his lap. "Because I know what it's like to need a place to stay and not have anywhere to go," he said finally. The words hit me like a physical blow, sudden and unexpected. I realized he was talking about me, about my situation, and that maybe his willingness to let me stay here came from a deeper place than simple kindness. "Marcus," I started, but he shook his head. "I'm not saying that to make you feel guilty. I'm saying it because sometimes when you have the power to help someone, you should. Even if it's complicated. Even if it doesn't make perfect sense." We looked at each other across the small distance of the couch, and I felt something shift between us. Like we'd moved past the careful politeness, past the tentative acknowledgement of attraction, into something more honest and immediate. "Why did you let me stay?" I asked, the question I'd been carrying around for weeks finally finding its way out of my mouth. He didn't answer at first, just looked at me with an expression that seemed to be weighing something. "Because you didn't ask anyone else," he said finally. "And if I had?" He looked at me for the first time in hours, really looked at me, like he was trying to memorize my face or decide whether to trust me with something important. "I would have told you to stay anyway," he said. The words hung in the air between us, heavy with everything we'd been dancing around for weeks. I felt my heart start beating faster, felt that familiar electricity that seemed to spark whenever we got too close to the truth of what was happening here. "Why?" I asked, though I thought I already knew the answer. "Because," Marcus said quietly, "I've been wanting an excuse to have you here since the day you and David broke up. And when you texted me asking for help, it felt like the universe giving me something I didn't know how to ask for." The confession settled between us like a challenge, like an invitation, like the answer to a question I'd been afraid to ask. I could see the vulnerability in his eyes, the way he was waiting for my response, probably expecting me to panic or retreat or remind him of all the reasons this was impossible. Instead, I found myself leaning forward, closing some of the distance between us on the couch. "Marcus," I said, and his name came out softer than I'd intended. "I know," he said quickly. "I know it's fucked up. I know the timing is terrible and the situation is all wrong, and there are probably laws against taking advantage of someone who's essentially homeless. You're not taking advantage of me, aren't I?" I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw someone who'd been carrying around the same want, the same complicated feelings, the same careful awareness that had been driving me crazy for weeks. Someone who'd opened his home to me not just out of kindness, but because he'd wanted me there. Because he'd been thinking about me, about us, about possibilities that neither of us had been brave enough to name. "No," I said firmly, "you're not." We sat there looking at each other in the soft light of the living room lamps, and I could feel everything changing between us. All the careful distance we'd been maintaining, all the polite boundaries we'd constructed were dissolving in the face of this admission. "So what happens now?" I asked. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him thinking, weighing options, trying to figure out how to navigate territory neither of us had mapped before. "I don't know," he said finally, "but I'm tired of pretending that nothing's happening here." "Me too." And with those words, we crossed a line we'd been dancing around for weeks. Not physically, we were still sitting on opposite ends of the couch, still maintaining that careful distance. But emotionally, we'd finally acknowledged what had been building between us since the moment I'd walked through his front door. What happened next, I realized, was up to both of us. "Yeah,